Afghanistan's tumultuous history, from serving as a buffer state in the Great Game to enduring the Soviet invasion and the rise of the Taliban, has shaped its present challenges and uncertain future. Covering a vast territory with a population in dire need, Afghanistan relies heavily on agriculture and possesses rich natural resources, yet struggles with economic instability exacerbated by recent political upheavals. Its water resources, vital for sustenance, are shared with neighboring countries. In the wake of the Taliban's resurgence, the nation faces profound questions regarding governance, stability, and human rights, while international engagement remains uncertain. As Afghanistan stands at a critical crossroads, its path forward hinges on addressing security concerns, upholding human rights, fostering diplomatic relations, and rebuilding its economy and infrastructure to ensure the well-being of its populace in the years to come. Afghanistan's economy, already fragile and heavily reliant on foreign aid, face a dire challenge exacerbated by the Taliban's takeover of Kabul. With approximately 40% of its GDP sourced from international aid, the suspension of foreign aid and freezing of Afghanistan banks' reserves, primarily held in the U.S., totaling around $9 billion, sent shockwaves through the country. The internal banking system froze, leaving citizens stranded in long queues outside banks and non-functioning ATMs, amplifying desperation as cash became scarce. Landlords, fearing Taliban seizures, even allowed tenants to stay rent-free. Meanwhile, Afghanistan witnessed a mass exodus as people flocked to the airport, seeking refuge from Taliban rule, further intensifying the humanitarian crisis amid economic instability and insecurity. Despite claims that the Taliban could sustain themselves through illicit means like mining, opium production, or trade, such revenue sources, while significant during insurgency, proved insufficient for governing effectively. Additionally, remittances from abroad, constituting 4% of the GDP, provided a lifeline amidst economic contraction and widespread deprivation, as the nation grappled with a daunting new normal. Before we begin our analysis, what does the future hold for Afghanistan? Let's dive into some historical perspective of the Afghan conundrum. Afghanistan's history is replete with wars and conflicts. In the late 19th century, the Great Game unfolded as Russia and Great Britain vied for control over Afghanistan, highlighting the nation's strategic significance. Despite British efforts, Afghanistan became independent in 1919, underlining its historical resistance to external influence. However, the Soviet invasion in 1979 thrust Afghanistan into another tumultuous era, triggering a prolonged conflict with far-reaching consequences. If one wants to analyze the future of the country, its history provides a rich set of experiences and possible lessons for the country's most recent transition. Before 1978 civil war, Afghanistan functioned as a monarchy under Muhammad Zahir Shah, who ascended to power in 1933. In the post-World War II era, the U.S. and the Soviet Union competed for influence in the region, with the U.S. establishing military ties with Pakistan in 1954, prompting Afghanistan to increasingly lean towards Soviet support. Despite convening a Loya Jirga in 1964 to discuss a draft constitution, Zahir Shah retained power, allowing political parties to organize but not compete in elections. His rule ended in 1973 when his cousin Daoud Khan aligned with the Parcham faction of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, overthrew him. Daoud's subsequent marginalization of Parchamis and distancing from the Soviet Union led to a reunion of PDPA factions in 1977, culminating in a coup in 1978. The Soviet Union intervened in December 1979, installing Bayabrak Karmal as president and initiating a brutal occupation marked by mass repression, torture, and executions. The conflict, which claimed about 1 million Afghan lives and displaced 5 million refugees, became a focal point of the Cold War, with the US and Saudi Arabia providing significant support to Afghan resistance, including Islamist radicals like Osama bin Laden, turning Afghanistan into a battleground shaped by external powers. The culmination of negotiations to end the war occurred with the signing of the 1988 Geneva Accords, a key element being the Soviet Union's commitment to withdraw all uniformed troops by February 1989.
I've just received a briefing from my national security advisors on the contents of the proposed Geneva agreements on Afghanistan that would provide for the complete withdrawal of Soviet occupation forces from that country. I believe the U.S. can now join the Soviet Union as a guarantor of the Geneva instruments.
Despite considerable Soviet assistance, the communist government managed to retain power until early 1992. During this period, the United Nations struggled to establish a transitional process acceptable to all parties, but these efforts proved futile. The U.S. and its allies suspended further peace process initiatives until the rise of the Taliban. While the UN's engagement with Afghanistan persisted, the lack of international commitment hindered progress. Donor countries, including the U.S., supported relief efforts, but ongoing war, donor fatigue, and the need to address other humanitarian crises left Afghanistan's aid initiatives consistently underfunded. In early 1992, a coalition named the Northern Alliance, comprising forces led by Tajik leader Ahmed Shah Massoud, General Abdul Rashid Dostum, and the Hazara faction emerged. This coalition took control of Kabul, preventing President Najibullah from leaving the country and derailing the UN transition. Despite internal conflicts, the Northern Alliance reached a coalition agreement on April 25th, excluding Hizb Islami, led by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. In June 1992, Burhanuddin Rabbani assumed the presidency of the Islamic State of Afghanistan, ISA, further escalating the conflict as Hekmatyar bombarded Kabul with rockets. Subsequent infighting led to widespread abductions and civilian casualties. In January 1994, Hekmatyar allied with General Abdul Rashid Dostum to oust Rabbani and Ahmad Shah Massoud, instigated a full-scale civil war in Kabul. By 1995, a third of the city laid in ruins, and the conflict claimed thousands of lives, primarily due to rocket and artillery attacks. During this period, Afghanistan experienced a fragmentation of power as various factions asserted control, leading to the emergence of local warlords and posing frequent challenges to humanitarian agencies operating in the country. The Taliban, composed of disillusioned former Mujahidin, rallied around Mullah Muhammad Omar with the aim of restoring stability and imposing Islamic law. Pakistan's support for the Taliban grew, recognizing strategic benefits by October 1994, and the Taliban's capture of Herat in September 1995 severed the land route to Iran. Subsequently, the Taliban seized Kabul in September 1996, prompting the retreat of forces led by Massoud. The return of Osama bin Laden further strengthened the Taliban's position, resulting in the renaming of the country to the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan by 1997. Under Taliban rule, strict Islamic law was enforced, leading to severe restrictions on women and the establishment of a moral behavior agency. Efforts to expand control northward sparked conflicts with Dostum's mini-state, particularly in Mazar-e-Sharif, where an alliance dissolution led to significant Taliban casualties. In response, the United Front, opposing the Taliban, emerged. The U.S. initiated strikes against bin Laden's camps in August 1998, and the UN imposed sanctions on the Taliban in October 1999 for failing to extradite bin Laden. Conflict persisted through 2000 and 2001, culminating in Massoud's assassination on September 9, 2001, just prior to the September 11th attacks. With Massoud's death, the United Front encountered significant challenges in its post-September 11 landscape. The trajectory of the United States' involvement in Afghanistan, spanning 4 presidencies from George W. Bush to Joe Biden, has been characterized by a series of strategic shifts, failures, and unresolved challenges. President Bush's declaration of the war on terror following the September 11, 2001 attacks in the United States led to a swift military intervention aimed at dismantling al-Qaeda and ousting the Taliban regime that harbored them. However, the subsequent nation-building efforts faced numerous obstacles, including the resurgence of the Taliban and the inability to establish stable governance structure. Despite initial military successes, the U.S. encountered difficulties in achieving its long-term objectives, with subsequent administrations grappling with the complexities of the Afghan conflict. The Bush administration's focus on military action and the establishment of a Wahhabian democracy encountered significant challenges as the Taliban adapted to local conditions and employed insurgency tactics learned from the Iraqi theater. The lack of attention to local socio-cultural dynamics and the failure to address underlying grievances allowed the Taliban to regain strength and support among segments of the Afghan population disaffected by government corruption and social services deficiencies. Additionally, the U.S. military effort in Iraq diverted resources and attention away from Afghanistan, further complicating the stabilization efforts. President Obama's Afghanistan-Pakistan strategy sought to stabilize both Afghanistan and Pakistan by recognizing the interconnected nature of the conflict and the importance of addressing terrorism emanating from the region. However, the insurgency persisted, exacerbated by instability in Pakistan's tribal regions, where al-Qaeda found sanctuary. Efforts to strengthen Pakistan's military and economy were hindered by ongoing security challenges and political tensions in Pakistan. The Trump administration's engagement with the Taliban marked a departure from previous approaches, culminating in the signing of a historic peace accord in Doha in 2020. However, the agreement faced criticism for its perceived concessions to the Taliban and the exclusion of the Afghan government from key negotiations. Despite initial optimism, intra-Afghan talks faltered, highlighting deep-seated divisions and the complexities of achieving a sustainable peace settlement. Ultimately, the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan in 2021 under the Biden administration precipitated the collapse of the Afghan government and the return of Taliban rule, sparked international condemnation and scrutiny.
When I came to office, I inherited a diplomatic agreement duly negotiated between the government of the United States and the Taliban that all U.S. forces would be out of Afghanistan. So in keeping with that agreement and with our national interest, the United States will begin our final withdrawal.
The United States' long drawn-out involvement in Afghanistan underscored the challenges of nation-building in conflict zones and the limitations of military solutions in addressing complex political and social dynamics. The failure to achieve a lasting peace settlement highlights the need for a comprehensive, multilateral approach that addresses the root causes of conflict and promotes inclusive governance and development initiatives. Following the Taliban's swift resurgence to power in August 2021, apprehensions about a return to their harsh governance of the 1990s have materialized over the past years. Despite assurances of moderation and reforms from certain Taliban factions, the group has largely adhered to draconian policies, marginalizing women from public life and suppressing dissent. A formal governance structure is yet to be established, with the interim cabinet appointed early in their tenure remain unchanged. The re-implementation of stringent measures has underscored the Taliban's authoritarian stance, raising concerns about the erosion of civil liberties and human rights. The Taliban's efforts to integrate fighters into formal state security roles have encountered significant challenges, particularly in remote regions where fighters lack formal training to serve people. In urban areas, former combatants have assumed roles in law enforcement and civil service offices, despite their limited experience in urban governance over the past 2 decades. Managing diverse urban populations and regions with non-Pashtun ethnic communities has proven challenging, with the Taliban struggling to protect historically marginalized groups. The group faces internal threats from the local Islamic State branch and external resistance from areas opposed to Taliban rule, leading to invasive raids and reports of extrajudicial killings targeting former security personnel and perceived dissidents. Likewise, the Taliban leadership remains predominantly Pashtun. Discontent among minority communities seeking representation has surfaced, fueled by perceptions of ethnic favoritism and militarized crackdowns. Instances of popular unrest, such as those witnessed in the northern majority Uzbek province of Faryab in January 2022, underscore the challenges being faced by the Taliban in building inclusive governance structures. Despite attempts to engage with local stakeholders, the Taliban's outreach efforts have yielded mixed results, highlighting the complexities of governing a diverse and fragmented society in the wake of ongoing security threats and internal divisions. William Byrd, an advisor at the United States Institute of Peace, delved into Afghanistan's economic landscape 1 year after the Taliban assumed power, thereby addressing key aspects of economic management, humanitarian concerns, aid prospects, and priorities for global stakeholders. According to Byrd, following the Taliban's ascendancy in August 2021, Afghanistan's economy drastically contracted by 20% to 30%, which led to widespread unemployment, diminished social services, and a deepening humanitarian crisis. The situation of hundreds of thousands, coupled with business closures and plummeting investments, exacerbated the crisis, leaving a significant portion of the population vulnerable to poverty, food insecurity, and disease prevalence. While signs of stabilization have emerged, economic recovery to pre-2021 levels remains elusive, with the country grappling with the enduring impacts of the collapse. Internally, Afghan businesses have managed to avert further closures, although operating at levels well below those before 2021. Although goods remain available and wage rates have steadied, inflation persists due to increasing food and energy prices. Mining activities, notably coal exports to Pakistan, have shown modest growth, offering some respite amidst economic turmoil.
The Afghan Taliban are reportedly boosting coal exports to Pakistan and have raised duties on sales to generate more revenue from its mining sector in the absence of foreign funding.
Nevertheless, the prevailing situation remains dire, with an estimated 70% of the populace unable to meet basic needs, perpetuating a state of famine equilibrium necessitating sustained humanitarian intervention. The Taliban's efforts to secure international legitimacy has encountered obstacles, including asset freezes by Western nations, the suspension of IMF access, and the cessation of World Bank funding, complicating the group's diplomatic recognition and access to essential resources. While the Taliban has sought acceptance through its UN General Assembly appeal, promising inclusivity and respect for human rights, concerns persist regarding its adherence to international norms, particularly regarding women's rights.
The United Nations is a credible institution in the world, and it is their duty to recognize our government. We also expect other countries in Europe, in the region, near and far, as well as Islamic countries, to strengthen their diplomatic relations with us and recognize our government.
Additionally, the complexities of international recognition are compounded by reservations from regional powers such as Russia, China, Iran, and Pakistan, which, despite initial openness, remain wary of the Taliban's governance, impeding explicit endorsement. Afghanistan's economic fragility is exacerbated by its heavy reliance on external aid, with a 25% contraction witnessed over the past 2 years. Taliban-imposed restrictions on women's education and employment further impede recovery efforts, with half of the population still languishing in poverty. While some progress has been made in meeting basic needs, households continue to grapple with vulnerability, exacerbated by limited access to financial services and employment opportunities. Afghanistan faces a dire humanitarian crisis marked by severe cash shortages, widespread unemployment, and unpaid salaries affecting public servants and security forces. Compounding the situation are enduring challenges stemming from a prolonged drought, the lingering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, and violence-induced displacement, all exacerbated by closed borders and soaring commodity prices, which have surged by 30 to 75%. The United Nations has sounded alarm bells, highlighting that 95% of families lack adequate food, with urban and rural areas alike bearing the brunt of food insecurity. The healthcare system teeters on the brink of collapse, with fewer than 1/5 of clinics operational, prompting the allocation of $45 million by the UN to address immediate health sector needs. In major cities like Kabul, desperation has driven individuals to sell personal belongings for survival. Following the Taliban's assumption of power in August 2021, immediate restrictions on girls' and women's rights prompted Western nations to isolate the regime through aid cuts, asset freezes, and sanctions. Contributing to economic contractions and widespread hunger and poverty. In 2022, amid the fears of famine and instability, donors adopted a less punitive stance, granting exemptions to sanctions and provided substantial humanitarian aid ranked second only to Ukraine. This aid likely averted famine, with donors hoping for policy moderation, particularly concerning girls and women. Talks in Oslo in January 2022 saw the Taliban commit to reopening female education, while Western envoys pledged economic support, including potential fund releases for Afghanistan's central bank. Engaging the Taliban is crucial, but recognition and engagement must be conditional, focusing on ensuring humanitarian aid access, ending extrajudicial actions and harassment, ensuring girls' education and freedom of movement, instituting a third-party monitoring mechanism for Human Rights, facilitating a representative Loya Jirga for an interim government leading to elections, maintaining the national flag for broader acceptance, and establishing effective aid distribution mechanisms with international organizations to address food shortages promptly. These measures represent the minimum for building confidence with the Taliban, as failure to address legitimacy could impede their ability to address security, governance, and humanitarian challenges effectively. The Afghan conflict, despite international marginalization, remains a significant regional security concern, evolving from East-West confrontation to sectarian conflict among powerful Islamic states in the post-Cold War era. This transformation has presented challenges for regional countries, particularly in Central Asia, on two levels. Firstly, Afghanistan's geostrategic importance has become critical due to the emergence of new ethnic-based states in Central Asia, altering the security environment and posing challenges shaped by religion, ethnicity, and regionalism. Secondly, the Cold War legacy has influenced strategic thinking among major regional countries, resulting in clash of interests and loose regional alignments around Afghanistan. The impact of the conflict on Central Asian countries encompasses threats related to religious ideology, affecting domestic politics, economic and developmental challenges, constraints on communication and energy pipelines, risks associated with the narco corridor from Afghanistan, trans-border terrorism, and the potential for refugee influx. As the Central Asian security profile evolves, the region is diversifying its security policy ties and orientations, while the Collective Security Treaty within the Commonwealth of Independent States CIS framework faces challenges and limitations. These changing dynamics create opportunities for increased engagement with the U.S. and other international actors, potentially influencing the future security policy environment in the region.
The Taliban seek international legitimacy and support. Any legitimacy, any support will have to be earned. And we heard that across the board.
In South Asia, Pakistan's role in Afghanistan, driven by the concept of strategic depth, has achieved some objectives, but has negatively impacted its domestic stability. Concerns about overstretch, distraction from the Kashmir issue with India, and the potential revival of the Pushtun issue complicate Pakistan's engagement. The Taliban's activities have isolated Pakistan on the Afghan issue, limiting its role as a dispassionate negotiator. Iran's relationship with Afghanistan has strained, especially after the rise of the Taliban, leading to military maneuvers along the Afghan border. India's strategic concerns in Afghanistan are linked to its security interests, territorial integrity, and the prevention of transnational terrorism. The Soviet occupation and subsequent Afghan imbroglio, exacerbated by Pakistan's support, have affected India's security. The rise of the Taliban, supported by Pakistan, has put India on the defensive geopolitically, focusing its concerns on border defense in Jammu and Kashmir. Despite immediate threats from the Taliban being countered on various fronts, long-term concerns stem from externally induced developments, including the growing Chinese nexus with Afghan Taliban, emphasizing the need for India to regain political influence and leverage in Afghanistan. The evolving geopolitical dynamics will continue shaping the security landscape, impacting the interests of regional and international actors. Despite the Taliban's deteriorating human rights record, particularly concerning women and girls, several factors are driving the United States and its allies toward increased engagement with the Taliban. Firstly, there's the pressing humanitarian need in Afghanistan and the depletion of safety nets for Afghans. Secondly, the significant funding gap for humanitarian aid in 2023, coupled with growing interest in resuming development assistance, underscores the urgency to address the country's challenges. Thirdly, the Taliban's steady consolidation of political power and their willingness to engage with the West, alongside evidence of cooperation on certain issues, are influencing international dynamics. As of August, the Afghanistan Humanitarian Response Plan for 2023 had received only 26.8% of the required $3.2 billion, revised down from the initial request of $4.6 billion. Donors' priorities have shifted toward avoiding dependency on humanitarian aid, improving efficiency, and focusing on livelihoods amid a global context of competing needs. However, the Taliban's human rights violations have posed a significant obstacle to broader engagement and the provision of traditional development aid by donor capitals. Nevertheless, as the time has passed, there's a growing recognition that Taliban rule is the reality that international actors must address. Punitive measures like sanctions and suspending dialogue have not effectively moderated Taliban policies, while regional states are increasing their engagement, potentially breaking the consensus on non-recognition. This pressure, combined with concerns about Afghan economic collapse and cross-border threats, compels Western engagement to maintain influence and stability in the region. Despite internal differences within the Taliban, including debates over policy moderation and security issues, the group remains a willing interlocutor with the West. While Kabul-based officials may influence policy implementation, engagement with the Taliban offers a potential path for influencing their behavior and promoting moderation. However, policymakers must be mindful not to replicate the failed approaches seen in North Korea, Iran, or Cuba, where punitive policies have prolonged suffering without incentivizing meaningful change. This window of opportunity for engagement with the Taliban may not remain open indefinitely, highlighting the importance of strategic and constructive diplomatic efforts to address Afghanistan's complex challenges. The future of Afghanistan post-Taliban takeover remains uncertain and hinges on various factors, each potentially shaping the country's trajectory in different ways. Firstly, there is the possibility of continued Taliban rule, wherein the group seeks to solidify its control, establish stability, and implement Islamic law, while potentially engaging with the international community on select issues. However, internal power struggles within the Taliban could emerge, leading to factional infighting and weakening the group's ability to govern effectively, thereby altering regional power dynamics. Another potential scenario is the resurgence of armed opposition, with various armed groups, including remnants of the ousted Afghan government forces resisting Taliban rule, potentially sparking a protracted insurgency reminiscent of pre-2001 conflicts. The compounded effects of ongoing political instability, economic challenges, and potential international isolation may exacerbate humanitarian crisis, worsening living conditions for the Afghan populace due to a lack of aid and resources. Moreover, the prospect of international engagement with the Taliban presents another avenue, where the international community may seek to diplomatically influence Taliban policies, particularly concerning human rights and inclusivity, potentially leading to either international recognition and support or increased isolation. The actions of regional powers such as India, Pakistan, China, Iran, and Russia will also significantly influence Afghanistan's political landscape as they seek to advance their own geopolitical interests. Counterterrorism concerns remain paramount, with the potential resurgence of terrorist organizations posing threats to regional and global security. The international community may closely monitor and intervene to counteract any rise in terrorism emanating from Afghan soil. Additionally, the possibility of a refugee crisis looms large, as deteriorating security and economic conditions may drive increased outflows of refugees from Afghanistan, straining neighboring countries and prompting international efforts to address the crisis. Lastly, Afghanistan faces significant economic challenges, exacerbated by the Taliban's policies, limited access to financial resources, and potential international sanctions.
Well, Afghanistan has been a country in chaos. Since the U.S. withdrawal, nearly half of its people are facing hunger. 6 million of them are at risk of famine.
It is the result of the sanction imposed on Afghanistan. So it returns to those who have imposed the sanctions, which have resulted in a humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan,
hindering economic recovery efforts. These interconnected factors signify the complexity and uncertainty surrounding Afghanistan's future, requiring a balanced approach and coordinated effort from both domestic and international stakeholders to navigate the country through its current challenges. Afghanistan's future remains shrouded in uncertainty, shaped by a complex interplay of internal strife, external influences, and shifting alliances. Under Taliban control, navigating the balance of power requires honoring commitments, managing internal factions, rectifying economic mismanagement, and seeking international legitimacy. Potential routes range from steps towards inclusivity, global engagement, and effective governance. Balancing national social cohesion necessitates addressing ethnic and religious diversity, safeguarding women's rights, and resolving human rights concerns. Economic development emerges as a linchpin amidst challenges such as poverty, aid dependency, high unemployment, and the specter of poppy farming. The role of regional powers like India, Pakistan, and Iran is pivotal, requiring a balancing act of interests, potential interventions, and addressing the refugee predicament. Security concerns loom large, encompassing terrorism, drug trafficking, and the spillover of international conflicts. The international community's role is crucial, ranging from humanitarian aid provision to Taliban engagement and recognition. Yet while discerning internal and external dynamics offers insight, precise projections remain elusive within this complex terrain. If you liked the video, do not forget to watch our previous uploads. Do like, share, and subscribe our channel for more in-depth analysis of contemporary issues.